In the suffocating heart of Alabama's summer 1855, when the air itself seemed to burn and the red clay roads turned to dust beneath the merciless sun, the county of Lowndes lay sprawled across the landscape like a sleeping beast, its belly full of cotton and blood. The plantations stretched endlessly, white fields rippling under hot winds, interrupted only by the dark silhouettes of overseers on horseback and the bent backs of hundreds of enslaved souls who worked from dawn until their bodies gave out. This was a land where power was measured in human property, where white men built empires on the breaking of black bodies, and where the line between civilization and savagery had long since blurred into something unrecognizable. The great houses stood proud with their columned porches and crystal chandeliers, imported from Europe, while just beyond their manicured gardens, the slave quarters festered, rows of wooden shacks with dirt floors and roofs that leaked when it rained, homes to people who had no homes, families that could be torn apart with a signature on a bill of sale, children who would never know their own surnames. Before the summer of 1855 ends, 4 enslaved people will flee into the forbidden swamp known as Devil's Pocket, hunted by 4 brothers, whose reputation for catching runaways is legendary across 3 counties. But when the hunters enter that cursed water, something ancient and angry will rise from the black depths to show them what it means to be prey. So subscribe now to witness this violent reversal of power, like if you're ready for a horror story rooted in America's darkest chapter, and comment what you think waits in those cypress shadows, because some debts can only be paid in blood and terror. The escape began on a moonless night in early August, when the heat had finally broken enough to breathe. 4 people, Josiah from the Hargrove cotton fields, Eliza from the Whitaker kitchen, and the brothers Amos and Levi from the McLean tobacco rows, met at a predetermined spot along the creek that marked the boundary between 3 plantations, a place where overseers rarely patrolled because the ground was too soft for horses. They came with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a stolen knife wrapped in cloth, a half-filled water skin, and a desperate hope that burned brighter than fear. Josiah was the oldest at 37, a man whose massive frame bore the scars of 2 decades of hard labor and harder punishment, whose back was a topographical map of whip marks that told the story of every time he dared to look a white man in the eye, or work too slowly, or simply exist in a way that displeased his masters. His hands were calloused to the point of being nearly numb, capable of picking 100 pounds of cotton in a day. But they trembled now as he helped Eliza cross the creek, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what they were attempting. Eliza was 28, thin as a rail from years of eating only what the white family didn't want, her face marked by a burn scar from when Mistress Whitaker had thrown a hot iron at her for oversalting the soup, her eyes holding a hardness that came from watching her 3 children sold away one by one to different buyers across the South. She moved with the efficient silence of someone who'd learned that visibility meant punishment, that the best survival strategy was to become a shadow, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the subtle shifts in white faces that meant danger was coming. Amos and Levi were younger, 22 and 19 respectively, born into slavery on the McLean place and never knowing anything else, but that didn't mean they'd accepted it. Amos was the taller of the 2, lean and quick, with eyes that constantly scanned his surroundings like a hunted animal, while Levi had the stockier build of their father, a man they barely remembered, sold downriver when Levi was 5, and a quiet intensity that made him seem older than his years. They'd been planning this escape for 6 months, ever since they'd heard whispers from a traveling blacksmith about the Underground Railroad, about safe houses and Quakers who would hide runaways, about routes north that could take you all the way to freedom if you were brave enough and lucky enough to survive the journey. The plan was simple in theory. Follow the creek north for 3 miles, then cut east toward the Devil's Pocket. Use the swamp to lose any dogs that might be set on their trail. Emerge on the other side and make for the Tennessee line. Find contacts who could pass them along to the next station. In practice, they all knew the odds were stacked impossibly against them. Most runaways were caught within 48 hours. Those who made it past the first week often died of exposure, starvation, or snake bites in the wilderness. And those few who actually reached free territory sometimes found it wasn't as free as they'd hoped, that bounty hunters could still snatch them off northern streets and drag them back south in chains. But staying meant death too, just a slower kind, the death of the soul that came from being worked like an animal, beaten like property, denied every human dignity, until you started to forget you'd ever been human at all. So they ran. The first hours were a blur of adrenaline and terror. every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot, every owl hoot like an alarm bell. They moved in single file, with Amos leading because he knew the woods best, having spent his childhood hunting rabbits and possums in these forests during the rare free hours on Sundays. Josiah brought up the rear, pausing frequently to listen for sounds of pursuit, his ears straining for the baying of hounds or the shouts of men on horseback. The creek gurgled beside them, its cool water reflecting starlight in fragmented patterns, and they stayed close to it, using its sound to mask their footsteps, occasionally wading through it to break their scent trail. By dawn they'd covered maybe 5 miles, far less than they'd hoped, and they took shelter in a dense thicket of blackberry bushes, lying flat on their bellies while flies buzzed around them, and the morning sun climbed higher, turning their hiding spot into an oven. They didn't speak, didn't even whisper, just lay there with hearts pounding, listening to the plantation wake up in the distance, the plantation bell ringing for morning work call, the sound that would normally have them scrambling out of their bunks to begin another 16-hour day of backbreaking labor under the overseer's watchful eye and ready whip. They waited until noon before moving again, their muscles cramping, throats parched, Eliza's lips cracked and bleeding. When they finally crawled out of the thicket, Levi spotted smoke rising from the direction of the Hargrove place. Lots of smoke, dark and angry, and Josiah's face went ashen because he knew what that meant. The masters had discovered their absence and were already organizing a search party. Standard procedure: gather the overseers, send riders to neighboring plantations to spread the word, bring out the bloodhounds, offer a reward for their capture, $50 a head, dead or alive, though preferably alive so they could be made examples of, whipped in front of the other slaves to remind everyone what happened when you tried to be free. Within hours, professional manhunters would be on their trail, men who made their living tracking down runaways, men like the Backwoods brothers, who were legendary throughout Alabama for their success rate and their brutality. Harlan Blackwood was 42 years old and had been hunting runaways since he was 16, learning the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father before that, a family business passed down through generations, like a blacksmith's tools or a farmer's land. The scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw was a badge of honor from a fight with a runaway in 1847, a man who'd nearly taken Harlan's eye out with a broken bottle before Harlan had put a bullet through his chest. Harlan wore that scar proudly because it proved he'd faced danger and won, that he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, that he was willing to risk his own life to maintain the natural order of things, which, in his view, meant white men on top and everyone else beneath them. His younger brothers worshipped him. Jed, at 34, was the meanest of the four, a man who took genuine pleasure in the hunt, who would sometimes track a runaway for days longer than necessary, just for the sport of it, who'd been known to beat captured slaves within an inch of their lives for the crime of making him chase them. He carried a Bowie knife with a foot-long blade that he sharpened every night, claiming it could split a man from sternum to groin in one stroke, and he'd proven it more than once. Tate, 31, was quieter, but no less dangerous, the one who handled the dogs. 5 bloodhounds he'd trained from puppies to track human scent with terrifying efficiency. He spoke to those dogs like they were his children, fed them better than most slaves ate, rewarded them with fresh meat when they successfully treed a runaway. And the youngest, Caleb, just 19, was still learning the trade, but eager to prove himself worthy of the Blackwood name, desperate to show his older brothers he wasn't soft, that he had the stomach for what needed to be done. They'd been hired by a consortium of 3 plantation owners, Hargrove, Whitaker, and McLean, each offering $50 per returned slave, $200 total if they brought back all 4. And the Blackwoods had accepted without hesitation because that was serious money, enough to buy new horses and upgrade their equipment, maybe even purchase a piece of land and start their own small plantation. They set out at midday with the sun high and merciless, riding good horses, well armed with rifles and pistols, carrying rope and iron shackles, leading Tate's pack of eager hounds who'd been given clothing from the runaways' quarters to establish the scent. The dogs bayed and strained at their leads, noses to the ground, pulling toward the creek where the trail began. Harlan felt the familiar rush of excitement that always came at the start of a hunt, that electric anticipation of matching wits against desperate prey, knowing he had every advantage, better weapons, better supplies, knowledge of the terrain, and the law entirely on his side. Runaways were property, and property couldn't commit crimes against its owners, couldn't defend itself legally, had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. If one of them died during the capture, Well, that was unfortunate but not illegal, and the Blackwoods would still collect half the bounty for returning a body that could at least serve as a warning to others. The trail led north along the creek, exactly as Harlan had predicted, because runaways always followed water, thinking it would hide their scent, which it did, to some extent. But the Blackwoods had been doing this long enough to know the patterns, to anticipate where fleeing slaves would emerge from the water, where they'd seek shelter, how they'd think and move. By mid-afternoon, they'd found the blackberry thicket where the four had hidden, the crushed grass and broken branches telling the story of their desperate rest. The hounds went wild, circling and baying, and Jed whooped with excitement, certain they'd have the runaways in hand by nightfall, already imagining how he'd spend his share of the reward money. But as they pushed deeper into the woods, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon and shadows lengthened between the pines, the trail led them toward a place that made even Harlan uneasy, the edge of the Devil's Pocket, a vast cypress swamp that locals avoided, a place where the water ran black and still, where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from twisted trees, where the air itself felt thick and wrong, pregnant with something that made the hairs on the back of Harlan's neck stand up, despite all his years of experience. The hounds had stopped baying. They stood at the swamp's edge, whining, refusing to go further despite Tate's commands and yanks on their chains. Jed cursed and suggested they push through anyway, that four slaves couldn't have gone far into that muck, that they were probably huddled on some hammock just inside the tree line, too scared to go deeper. But Harlan stared at the black water and remembered stories his grandfather had told, stories about slaves who'd run into the pocket and never been seen again, not captured, not found dead, just vanished, as if the swamp had swallowed them whole. Stories about lights seen floating over the water at night, about voices calling from the fog, about hunters who'd gone in and come out changed, if they came out at all. He'd always dismissed those tales as superstition, the kind of ghost stories that frightened children and simple-minded folks told around fires. But standing here now, watching the mist rise from the stagnant water like something breathing, feeling the oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even their horses' movements, Harlan felt a cold finger of doubt trace his spine. Caleb shifted in his saddle, eyes darting between his older brothers and the dark water ahead, waiting for someone to make the decision that would determine whether they pushed forward or turned back. The youngest Blackwood had never been deep into the Devil's Pocket before, had only heard the stories whispered around campfires and in taverns, tales of men who'd wandered in and come out days later, babbling about voices in the fog, about hands reaching up from the mud, about trees that moved when you weren't looking. He'd always assumed those were just tall tales, the kind of ghost stories drunk men told to scare greenhorns and entertain themselves during long nights. But standing here now, watching the mist curl up from the black water, like fingers beckoning them forward, watching the way even Tate's fearless hounds whined and pulled backward on their chains, Caleb felt his stomach twist with a fear that had nothing to do with the physical danger of tracking armed runaways through difficult terrain. This was something older, something that touched the primitive part of his brain, that still believed in things that couldn't be explained by Sunday sermons or rational thought. Jed broke the silence with characteristic bravado, spitting tobacco juice into the water and declaring that he didn't give a damn what the dogs thought, that four slaves couldn't have gotten far into that muck, that they were probably huddled somewhere just inside the tree line, waiting to be dragged out and beaten sensible. He swung down from his horse with exaggerated confidence, checking his pistols and adjusting the Bowie knife on his belt, making a show of fearlessness that Caleb recognized as performance, the kind of thing Jed always did when he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he wasn't scared. Harlan studied the water's edge for another long moment, then nodded slowly, making the decision that would seal all their fates, though he didn't know it yet. They'd go in on foot, he announced, leave the horses here with Caleb to guard them, while the three older brothers took the dogs and pushed into the swamp to flush out their quarry before nightfall. Caleb started to protest, wanting to prove he wasn't afraid, wanting to show he deserved to be part of the hunt, but Harlan cut him off with a sharp look and reminded him that someone had to protect their animals and equipment, that it was an important job even if it wasn't glamorous. The truth, which both of them understood without saying it aloud, was that Harlan was trying to protect his youngest brother, keeping him out of whatever waited in that black water, giving him a chance to survive if things went wrong. Tate gathered his three best tracking hounds, leaving the other two with Caleb, and the three older Blackwoods waded into the Devil's Pocket as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Rifles held high, boots sinking into mud, that released bubbles of foul-smelling gas with each step. Spanish moss brushing their faces like cold fingers in the gathering gloom. The swamp swallowed them almost immediately, the solid ground of the forest giving way to a treacherous maze of hummocks and channels, where one wrong step could plunge you into water over your head or into mud that would suck you down like quicksand. The cypress trees rose around them like ancient sentinels, their trunks massive and twisted, their roots forming gnarled knees that jutted from the water at odd angles, creating natural obstacles that had to be climbed over or navigated around. The canopy overhead was so thick that even though sunset was still an hour away, the light beneath it had already dimmed to a murky twilight, where shadows pooled in every hollow and distance became impossible to judge. The dogs pulled forward eagerly at first, following the scent trail that led deeper into the swamp. But after 20 minutes their enthusiasm began to wane, their baying turning uncertain, their movements more hesitant. Tate cursed and yanked their chains, demanding they keep working, but the animals were responding to something he couldn't sense, some wrongness in the air that made their hackles rise and their ears lay flat against their skulls. Harlan called a halt on a relatively dry hummock, pulling out his compass to check their heading, and discovered with a chill that the needle was spinning lazily in circles, unable to find north, as if the magnetic field itself had gone haywire in this cursed place. Jed laughed nervously and suggested the compass must be broken, that Harlan had probably dropped it or gotten it wet. But they all knew that wasn't true, knew the instrument had been working perfectly fine just minutes before they entered the swamp. Harlan pocketed the useless compass and said they'd navigate by the sun when they could see it, by the moss on the trees when they couldn't, old wilderness tricks his grandfather had taught him. They pressed on, following the dogs who were now moving with reluctance, having to be dragged forward rather than pulling against their restraints. The water around them was perfectly still, not a ripple disturbing its surface, except for the ones they created themselves, and that stillness felt wrong too, because there should have been fish jumping, turtles surfacing, water snakes swimming, all the normal life of a healthy swamp. But this water was dead, or seemed to be, and when Jed knelt to fill his canteen from what looked like a clear spring, Harlan snapped at him not to drink it, that something about the taste would be off. That water this still was probably poisoned by rot and decay, even if it looked clean. The farther they penetrated into the devil's pocket, the more convinced Harlan became that this was a mistake, that they should turn back while they still could, but pride wouldn't let him voice those doubts aloud, wouldn't let him be the one to call retreat when his brothers were counting on him to be brave, to be the leader, to show them how it was done. Meanwhile, deeper in the swamp, the four runaways huddled on a narrow strip of relatively dry ground, exhausted and terrified, listening to the distant baying of hounds that told them their pursuers had followed them into this nightmare place. Josiah had led them here deliberately, following half-remembered stories his grandfather had told him about the Devil's Pocket being a place where slave catchers feared to tread, where the boundaries between the living world and the spirit world grew thin, where the dead who'd been murdered in these woods and thrown into this water still walked and watched and waited for vengeance against their oppressors. He'd been gambling that the Backwoods' fear of the swamp would outweigh their greed for the bounty, that they'd give up the chase rather than risk entering this cursed territory. But the continued sound of dogs told him he'd lost that bet, that the Manhunters were coming anyway, driven by pride or stupidity or simple hatred to follow their prey into a place that should have warned them away. Eliza whispered that they needed to keep moving, that sitting still meant being caught, but her voice trembled with exhaustion and fear because she knew as well as Josiah did that they couldn't run much further, that their bodies were at the breaking point, that sooner or later they'd have to make a stand and fight or surrender and die. Amos was the first to notice the change in the atmosphere, the way the temperature had dropped despite the summer heat, the way the mist rising from the water seemed to have faces in it, if you looked at it from the corner of your eye. Fleeting impressions of human forms that vanished when you tried to focus on them directly. He'd grown up hearing stories about haints and spirits, about how the dead don't rest easy when they die violently, about how places soaked in blood and suffering become thin spots where the veil between worlds wears through. His grandmother had been brought over from Africa as a girl, had carried with her the old religions and the old knowledge, had taught Amos that ancestors were always watching, that they could be called upon for help, but also had to be respected, that powerful places demanded offerings and respect. He suggested in a whisper that maybe they should leave something for the spirits here, some token of respect, some acknowledgement that they were trespassing on haunted ground and needed permission to pass. Levi thought his brother had lost his mind from fear and exhaustion, But Josiah surprised him by nodding slowly, reaching into his pocket for the one valuable thing he still possessed, a small carving his son had made before being sold away, a crude wooden figure that Josiah had kept hidden from the overseers for 5 years, his only connection to a child he'd never see again. With hands that shook, he knelt at the water's edge and placed the carving on a cypress knee, murmuring a prayer to ancestors he'd never known, asking for protection, asking for justice, asking for the strength to survive one more day of running, one more night of fear. The water rippled though there was no wind. The mist thickened though the air had been clear moments before, and from somewhere in the gathering darkness came a sound that made all 4 of them freeze. A voice, or many voices, murmuring words they couldn't quite make out, speaking in languages they didn't know, rising and falling like a tide of whispered secrets. Eliza crossed herself and prayed to the Christian God she'd been taught to worship, even though that God had never stopped her children from being sold, had never prevented her own enslavement, had never seemed to hear her prayers for deliverance. But she prayed anyway because it was all she knew to do, because hope was a stubborn thing that refused to die, even when logic said it should. The voices grew louder, more distinct, and now they could make out individual words, names, hundreds of names, called out in tones of sorrow and rage, a litany of the dead who'd passed through this place, who'd been hunted and caught and killed, whose bones rested at the bottom of this black water, whose spirits had nowhere else to go because they died without proper burial, without the ceremonies that would let them rest, without justice for the crimes committed against them. Josiah felt something shift inside him, a connection forming between his own desperate flight and the countless others who'd run before him, failed before him, died before him, a chain of suffering stretching back generations to the first Africans dragged onto these shores in chains. He whispered to the others that they weren't alone here, that the dead were with them, and whether that was comfort or terror, he couldn't say. Back along the trail, the Blackwood brothers heard the voices too, though they interpreted them differently, telling themselves it was just wind through the trees, just the natural sounds of a swamp at dusk, just their imaginations playing tricks after hours of tense hunting in difficult terrain. But the dogs knew better. The 3 hounds began pulling backward frantically, yelping and whining, trying desperately to retreat towards solid ground. And when Tate yanked harder on their chains, the lead dog snapped at him, something it had never done before, teeth clicking shut inches from his hand. Tate swore and backhanded the animal, then watched in horror as all 3 dogs broke their restraints simultaneously, chains snapping with sharp cracks, and bolted back the way they'd come, crashing through the undergrowth in blind panic. Jed raised his rifle to shoot one as an example, to punish the animals for cowardice, but Harlan knocked the barrel down and hissed at him not to waste ammunition, that they'd need every bullet before this was over. Without the dogs to track by scent, they were reduced to following visible trail signs, and those were becoming harder to spot in the failing light. The footprints in mud, filling with water, almost as fast as they were made. The broken branches already being reclaimed by the aggressive swamp vegetation. They should have turned back then. Any rational man would have turned back. But the Blackwood brothers weren't rational anymore, weren't thinking clearly, were caught in the momentum of the hunt and their own pride, and the terrible certainty that retreating meant admitting they'd been beaten by 4 slaves. That word would spread through every plantation in 3 counties about how the famous Manhunters had been scared off by a swamp, that they'd never lived down the shame. So they pushed forward, weapons ready, moving from hummock to hummock with increasing difficulty as full darkness fell, and they had to light lanterns that cast jumping shadows across the water and made everything beyond their small circle of light seem even more threatening. Tate was the first to see something that couldn't be explained away as imagination or natural phenomena, a figure standing motionless in the water 50 feet ahead, human-shaped but wrong in proportions, too tall or too thin or too something, its outline wavering like heat shimmer, even though the night air was cool. He called out a challenge, demanding it identify itself, and the figure turned its head toward him with a movement that was too slow, too deliberate, and he caught a glimpse of a face that might have been human once but had been underwater too long, features bloated and distorted, eyes gone milky white. Jed fired his rifle at it, the shot deafening in the confined space, and the figure jerked backward from the impact but didn't fall, didn't bleed, just stood there swaying slightly before sinking beneath the surface without a ripple. Harlan's hands were shaking now, his breath coming fast and shallow, and he finally admitted what they all knew in their guts. Something was very wrong here. This wasn't a normal hunt. They needed to get out while they still could. But when they tried to retrace their steps, they found the path they'd used had vanished. The hummocks they'd crossed now separated by channels of black water that hadn't been there before, or had they taken a wrong turn in the darkness? Was this even the same place they'd come through? The compass was still useless, spinning aimlessly, and the lanterns seemed to be burning dimmer despite having fresh oil, their light unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the oppressive darkness. They were lost, turned around completely, and the realization of their helplessness hit them like a physical blow. Jed started to panic, voice rising as he demanded to know which way was out. Why couldn't they find the trail? What the hell was happening here? Harlan told him to shut up and let him think, trying to remember his training, trying to use logic and wilderness skills to navigate them to safety. But this place defeated logic, operated by rules that had nothing to do with magnetic north or prevailing winds or any of the normal tools of orientation. And then the water began to move, not with the normal ripples of wind or current, but with purpose, with intelligence, with hundreds of small disturbances that suggested things rising from below, surfacing just enough to break the tension before sinking back down. Tate saw them first, hands, dozens of pale hands, reaching up from the black depths, fingers spread wide as if grasping for something just out of reach. He screamed and stumbled backward, nearly falling into a channel, catching himself at the last second on a cypress knee that felt unnaturally cold under his palm, as if the tree itself had been dead for years despite the living moss that hung from its branches. Jed fired his rifle at the nearest hand, the shot echoing across the water like thunder, and had the satisfaction of seeing the appendage jerk and disappear. But three more rose to replace it, and now the brothers could see that the hands were attached to arms, and the arms to bodies that were wrong in every way that mattered. Skin bloated and peeling, clothes rotted to rags, faces that had spent too long underwater, eyes gone milky white but somehow still seeing, still focused with terrible intensity on the three living men who'd invaded their domain. Harlan's military training kicked in despite his terror, and he barked orders to form up back to back, to conserve ammunition, to aim for center mass, and make every shot count. But even as he gave those commands, part of his mind was screaming that this couldn't be happening, that dead things didn't walk, that there had to be a rational explanation. Swamp gas causing hallucinations, fever from bad water, mass hysteria brought on by exhaustion and fear. The figures kept coming, wading through water that should have been too deep to stand in, moving with the inexorable patience of things that had all the time in the world, because time no longer meant anything to them. Harlan recognized faces now, recognized them from wanted posters and reward notices, recognized slaves he'd personally tracked down and returned over the years. Men and women he'd watched being whipped or sold or worked to death, their crimes nothing more than the desire to be free, their punishment the full weight of a system designed to crush any hint of rebellion or hope. There was Samuel, who'd run 3 times and been caught 3 times and finally hanged as an example, his neck still bent at the wrong angle from the rope. There was Dinah, who'd tried to poison her master and been burned alive, her skin still showing the char marks of the flames. There was Moses and his 2 sons, who'd made it all the way to Tennessee before being dragged back and beaten so severely that all 3 had died of their injuries, their bodies dumped in this very swamp rather than given proper burial because the owners considered them less than human, unworthy of the rituals accorded to dead horses or dogs. They rose from the water like a tide of vengeance, and their eyes held no mercy, no forgiveness, only the cold calculation of those who'd been wronged beyond measure and now had the chance to balance the scales. Jed broke first, his famous courage evaporating in the face of enemies he couldn't intimidate or hurt, enemies who didn't flinch from his Bowie knife or respect his reputation as a hard man not to be crossed. He turned to run and made it 3 steps before the mud beneath his feet suddenly liquefied, became something more like water than earth, and he sank to his knees, then his waist, then his chest, clawing frantically at the solid ground that remained forever just inches from his grasping fingers. Tate reached for him, tried to pull him out, but hands, so many hands, grabbed Jed from below, cold fingers wrapping around his legs and arms and throat, pulling him down with relentless strength, while he screamed and thrashed and begged his brothers to help him. Harlan fired into the water around Jed, bullets churning the surface but doing nothing to stop the descent, and within seconds his brother's head went under, mouth still open in a scream that was cut off by black water pouring down his throat, eyes wide with the knowledge of his own death. The surface bubbled and roiled for a moment, then went smooth as glass and Jed was gone, pulled down to join the others who rested at the bottom of the Devil's Pocket. One more body added to the swamp's collection, one more debt paid in flesh and terror. Tate went mad then, truly mad, firing his rifle wildly into the surrounding figures, screaming curses and prayers in equal measure, demanding to know what kind of devil's magic this was. What unholy power could raise the dead and turn them into instruments of vengeance? One of the figures, a woman he didn't recognize but who clearly recognized him, whose milky eyes fixed on his face with burning hatred, spoke, and her voice was like wet sand grinding together, like words being forced through a throat that had forgotten how to shape them. She said his name, said it with such venom that he felt it like a physical blow, and then she told him what he'd done to her, how he'd tracked her through 3 counties with his dogs, how he'd celebrated when they'd cornered her, how he'd watched while the plantation owner who'd hired him had beaten her to death for the crime of trying to reach her children who'd been sold to a family in Mississippi. Tate had no memory of her specifically. There had been so many hunts over the years, so many faces that blurred together, but she remembered him with perfect clarity, remembered every detail of the worst day of her existence, and now she'd been given the chance to return the favor. She reached for him with hands that dripped black water, and when her fingers touched his face, Tate felt cold spread through his body like ice forming in his veins, felt his limbs go numb and unresponsive, felt his lungs seize up as if he were drowning in air. He collapsed onto the hummock, gasping like a landed fish, and the figure knelt beside him, placed her rotting hand over his nose and mouth, and held it there while he suffocated slowly, his own body betraying him, refusing to fight or struggle, every muscle locked in place by whatever power she wielded. His last sight was her face hovering inches from his own, watching his death with the same clinical interest he'd shown watching so many others suffer. Harlan was alone now, the last of the Blackwood brothers, surrounded by a ring of the dead, who made no move to rush him, but simply stood there waiting, patient as stone, as if they knew the outcome was inevitable, and were content to let fear do most of their work for them. He could feel his sanity fraying at the edges, could feel the carefully constructed worldview that had sustained him for 4 decades, crumbling under the weight of this impossible reality. Everything he'd been taught, everything he believed about the natural order of things, about white supremacy and black inferiority, about his right to hunt and hurt and own other human beings, all of it was revealed as the lie it had always been, the comfortable fiction that let him sleep at night, despite the blood on his hands. These dead had been people, fully human people, with hopes and dreams and loved ones, people who'd laughed and cried and struggled and died for the simple crime of being born with the wrong color skin in a world that had decided that was enough reason to enslave them. And now they'd come back, or been called back, or never really left. And they wanted what was owed to them. Not money or land or even apologies, but the one thing that might begin to balance the scales, the lives of their oppressors, taken with the same casual cruelty that had been shown to them. The ring parted, and through the gap came 4 living people, Josiah, Eliza, Amos, and Levi, moving with the confidence of those who knew they were protected, who understood that the power here belonged to them and their ancestors, not to the man with the rifle and the reputation for never letting his prey escape. Josiah stopped 10 feet from Harlan, close enough to see every detail of the manhunter's face, close enough to smell the fear sweat pouring off him, and he spoke for the first time since they'd entered the swamp, his voice steady and clear, and utterly without mercy. He said that this was the end of the hunt, that the Devil's Pocket had reversed the chase and turned the hunters into the hunted, that every drop of blood spilled in the name of slavery had soaked into this ground and fed something ancient and angry that had finally been given permission to rise and take vengeance. He said that Harlan could die here like his brothers, quickly or slowly depending on how much he'd sinned in his lifetime, or he could be allowed to leave and carry a message back to every plantation owner and overseer and slave catcher in Alabama, that the old rules were ending, that the dead were watching, that the day of reckoning was coming sooner than anyone expected. Eliza added her voice to his, saying that she'd called on her grandmother's gods, on the Orishas that had traveled with her people across the ocean, on the spirits of water and forest that had inhabited this land long before Europeans came to claim it, and those powers had answered, had merged with the Christian God she'd been forced to worship, and created something new, something that could bend the rules of life and death just enough to allow this moment of justice. Harlan's rifle shook in his hands, barrel pointed at Josiah's chest, finger on the trigger, but he couldn't make himself pull it, because he understood with absolute certainty that killing these 4 wouldn't save him. that the dead surrounding them would tear him apart the instant he fired, that his only chance of survival lay in accepting their terms and agreeing to become their messenger. He asked in a voice that cracked and wavered what guarantee he had that they'd let him leave, what promise he could trust when made by monsters. Josiah smiled without humor and said he had no guarantee except the word of people he'd spent his whole life hunting and hurting, people who by all rights should kill him where he stood and add his bones to the collection at the bottom of this cursed water. But unlike the men who'd enslaved them, who'd broken every promise ever made to black people in this country, unlike the government that had written all men are created equal while allowing millions to be held in chains, unlike the Christians who preached love and forgiveness while building their churches with slave labor, unlike all of them, Josiah and his companions would keep their word, because that was the difference between the oppressed and the oppressor, between those who'd retained their humanity and those who'd sold it for profit. If Harlan agreed to carry their message, to tell the truth about what happened here, to warn others that the Devil's Pocket was now sanctuary for runaways and death for hunters, then he'd be allowed to walk out of this swamp alive. But if he ever came back, if he ever lifted a hand against another fleeing slave, if he ever participated in the machinery of oppression again, they'd find him no matter how far he ran. And they'd bring him back here to join his brothers in the mud at the bottom of a swamp that never forgot and never forgave. Harlan dropped his rifle, the weapon falling from nerveless fingers to splash into the water at his feet, and nodded once, accepting terms he had no power to negotiate. The ring of dead parted again, showing him a path through the darkness, a trail that led back toward solid ground and the world of the living. He walked that path on legs that barely supported his weight, passing close enough to some of the dead to touch them, to smell the decay that clung to their waterlogged clothes, to see the wounds that had killed them still gaping on their bodies. They watched him pass in silence, hundreds of eyes tracking his progress, bearing witness to the man who'd helped keep them in chains, now fleeing like a rabbit from wolves, and he felt the weight of their judgment settle on his shoulders, like a physical burden he'd carry for the rest of his life. When he finally stumbled out of the swamp hours later, emerging from the cypress trees into the gathering dawn, he found Caleb waiting where they'd left him, the youngest Blackwood pacing anxiously, the horses nervous and skittish, the remaining dogs whining. Caleb's face lit up with relief when he saw his oldest brother, then fell into horror as he took in Harlan's condition, clothes torn and muddy, face aged 10 years in a single night, eyes holding a 1,000-yard stare that spoke of things seen that could never be unseen. When Caleb asked where Jed and Tate were, Harlan just shook his head and said they weren't coming back, that they'd go to tell the plantation owners the hunt was over, that the 4 slaves had disappeared into the swamp and couldn't be tracked further, that the Devil's Pocket had claimed them as it claimed everyone foolish enough to enter its borders. The reversal was complete, the hunters defeated, and word spread through the slave quarters of 3 counties within days, whispered from field to kitchen to blacksmith's forge, that something had shifted in the Alabama backwoods, that the dead had risen to protect the living, that runaways who could make it to the Devil's Pocket would find sanctuary there, guarded by ancestors who remembered every whip and chain and broken promise. And in the years that followed, no manhunter dared enter that cursed water again, and the swamp became a legend that grew with each telling, a place where the natural order had been overturned and justice, long delayed, had finally been served. When the Blackwood brothers tracked 4 escaped slaves into Alabama's Forbidden Swamp in 1855, they discovered too late that the hunted had become the hunters, and the dead had risen to demand payment for centuries of blood, proving that some debts can't be escaped, and some places remember everything. Subscribe to see how this supernatural uprising changed the slave trade forever. Like if this violent reversal gave you chills, comment which moment horrified you most and share because the Devil's Pocket still whispers its warnings to anyone who'll listen. The news of what happened in the Devil's Pocket spread through Lowndes County like wildfire through dry grass, carried by slaves who whispered it in the fields, by free black people who shared it in the quarters during rare Sunday gatherings, by a few sympathetic whites who heard the story and recognized truth when they heard it, despite how impossible it sounded. Harlan Blackwood returned to the plantation owners who'd hired him, Hargrove, Whitaker, and McLean, and delivered his report in a smoke-filled parlor, while the 3 white men sat in leather chairs and drank bourbon and tried to make sense of words that challenged everything they understood about how the world worked. He told them the hunt had failed, that his brothers were dead, that the 4 runaways had escaped into the swamp and couldn't be tracked further without risking more lives. He didn't tell them about the risen dead, or the voices in the fog, or the hands reaching up from black water because he knew they'd call him mad, knew they'd spread word that he'd lost his nerve and invented ghost stories to cover his failure. But something in his eyes, some haunted quality that hadn't been there before, made even these hardened men uncomfortable, made them suspect that whatever had happened in that cursed place had been worse than mere failure, had been something that broke men in ways that couldn't be fixed. Hargrove offered to hire new hunters to double the bounty and bring in professionals from as far away as Georgia and Mississippi, men who had no history with the devil's pocket and wouldn't be superstitious about entering it. But Harlan shook his head slowly and said with absolute conviction that no amount of money would convince anyone who knew these woods to go into that swamp again. That word was already spreading among the manhunting community that the pocket was off limits, that something had changed there, that the old certainties no longer applied. He suggested they write off the loss of 4 slaves, expensive but survivable, and focus on tightening security on their remaining property, on making it harder for others to attempt escape, on setting examples through punishment that would discourage future runaways. The plantation owners didn't like it, didn't like admitting defeat or accepting that there were now places in their own county where their authority didn't reach. But they also weren't willing to throw good money after bad, weren't ready to sacrifice more men to prove a point when the first attempt had gone so catastrophically wrong. They paid Harlan half of what they'd promised, money for the hunt, if not for the capture, and sent him away with warnings not to spread defeatist talk that might give their slaves ideas about running. But it was too late to contain the story because Josiah and Eliza and Amos and Levi had become legends overnight. Their successful escape elevated into something almost mythological, proof that resistance was possible, that the system wasn't as unbreakable as the masters claimed. In the weeks that followed their flight, 3 more slaves disappeared from plantations around Lowndes County, all of them last seen heading toward the backwoods, toward the cypress trees and black water that now represented something between hope and terror. The plantation owners responded with increased patrols and harsher punishments for even minor infractions, trying to reassert control through fear and violence, the only tools they really understood. Overseers were armed with better weapons and given permission to shoot runaways on sight rather than wasting time and money on capture. Curfews were tightened, movement between plantations restricted, the few privileges that had made slavery marginally more bearable. Sunday gatherings, limited travel to visit family on other properties, the ability to earn small amounts of money through extra work, were revoked in a collective punishment meant to make clear that everyone would suffer for the actions of a few. But these measures had the opposite of their intended effect, because they made life so intolerable that more people started contemplating escape despite the risks, started whispering about the devil's pocket during stolen moments in the fields or the kitchens, started wondering if maybe, just maybe, the protection offered by that cursed place was real. The 4 runaways themselves remained in the swamp for weeks after the Backwoods defeat, living on fish and whatever grew in that watery wilderness, sleeping on narrow strips of dry ground, constantly aware of the presence that surrounded them, the dead who'd risen to their defense, and who now seemed content to simply watch and wait, visible sometimes as shadows moving through the mist, as ripples on still water, as voices carried on wind that smelled of decay and old violence. Josiah found himself speaking to them sometimes, thanking them for their intervention, asking for guidance about when it would be safe to leave, whether they should try to make it further north or establish some kind of permanent settlement here in this place that had become sanctuary. The responses came in dreams mostly, visions that showed him routes through the swamp that led to the Tennessee line, safe paths known only to the dead who'd walked them before, places where sympathetic people, both black and white, though the white allies were rare as hen's teeth, might offer food and shelter and directions to the next station on an underground railroad that was more rumor than reality in this part of Alabama. Eliza prayed constantly. Her Christian faith and her grandmother's African spirituality merged into something new, a synthesis born of necessity and survival that acknowledged multiple paths to the divine, multiple sources of power that could be called upon in times of desperate need. She made offerings at the water's edge, food they could barely spare, small tokens salvaged from their flight, and felt in her bones that these gifts were accepted, that some kind of bargain had been struck between the living and the dead, between those who still drew breath and those who'd been murdered for trying to do exactly what she was doing now. Amos and Levi adapted in their own ways, the younger brothers taking on the practical tasks of survival. building crude shelters from cypress branches and Spanish moss, setting fish traps in the shallow channels, learning to navigate by landmarks that shifted and changed, but somehow always led back to safe ground if you knew how to read them. They'd grown up in slavery, never known freedom except as an abstract concept spoken of in hushed tones when no white people were listening. And now they found themselves in a liminal space that was neither bondage nor true liberty, a place between worlds where the normal rules suspended and anything seemed possible. Levi, the youngest, sometimes wondered aloud if they should just stay here forever, build a life in the swamp, establish a community of runaways who could defend each other with the help of the spectral guardians who seemed bound to this place. But Josiah always shook his head when this idea came up, saying that survival wasn't the same as freedom, that living in a swamp surrounded by the unquiet dead wasn't the life he wanted for himself or anyone else, that they needed to keep moving, keep pushing toward actual free territory where they could build real homes and raise families and live without looking over their shoulders every moment of every day. After a month in the Devil's Pocket, they made their move, following one of the dream paths Josiah had been shown, navigating through channels that should have been impassable, but somehow opened before them, emerging on the far side of the swamp onto solid ground that felt almost shocking after so long on unstable mud and water. They traveled by night for 2 weeks, hiding during the day in whatever cover they could find, eating berries and stolen corn, drinking from streams, always moving north and east toward the Tennessee line. They had close calls, dogs that caught their scent but somehow lost it again, patrols that passed within feet of their hiding spots but never quite looked in the right direction, a bounty hunter who cornered them in a barn, but whose pistol misfired 3 times before they escaped into darkness. Josiah recognized the protection of the Devil's Pocket in these near misses, felt the presence of their spectral allies traveling with them, even beyond the swamp's physical boundaries, watching over them until they crossed into territory where other forces could take up the burden of their safety. They made it to Tennessee in late September, crossing the state line at night through a forest so thick and dark they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces, stumbling forward on faith and exhaustion until they emerged into a clearing where a small house stood with a lantern burning in the window, a signal they'd been told of a safe place, a station on the Underground Railroad. The woman who opened the door was white, middle-aged, with hard hands and kind eyes, and she ushered them inside without questions, fed them the first hot meal they'd eaten in months, gave them clean clothes to replace their rags, let them sleep in actual beds with sheets and pillows, luxuries they'd almost forgotten existed. Her name was Margaret, and she was a Quaker, part of a network of religious abolitionists who risked imprisonment and violence to help escaped slaves reach free territory. She told them they'd made it further than most people who tried to run from the Deep South, that the odds had been stacked impossibly against them, that their survival was either incredible luck or divine intervention, and from the way she looked at them when she said it, Josiah suspected she'd heard some version of what happened in the Devil's Pocket, that stories about them had preceded their arrival even into Tennessee. Back in Alabama, the legend continued to grow. More slaves disappeared into the backwoods, not all of them heading for the Devil's Pocket, but emboldened by the knowledge that such a place existed, that resistance was possible, that the machinery of oppression could be defied and sometimes even defeated. The plantation owners responded with ever more draconian measures, buying more dogs, building higher fences, instituting pass systems that required written permission for any movement at all, treating their human property with a paranoia that revealed how fragile their control had always been, how dependent their entire society was on the acquiescence of those they enslaved. Some of the smarter owners, and there weren't many, began to realize that the institution they'd defended as natural and necessary and ordained by God was actually sitting on a powder keg, that every act of cruelty and oppression added fuel to a fire that would eventually consume them all. But most refused to see it, clung to their myths about racial superiority and the natural order of things, convinced themselves that a few runaways didn't represent any real threat to a system that had endured for 2 centuries and would endure for centuries more. Harlan Blackwood never hunted runaways again. He tried once, about 6 months after the incident in the Devil's Pocket, when a desperate plantation owner offered him an enormous bounty to track down a particularly valuable slave who'd run. But the moment Harlan saw the bloodhounds and felt the weight of rope in his hands, something inside him broke completely, and he found himself on his knees vomiting in the dirt, while memories of cold hands and milky eyes and his brother's screams flooded back with overwhelming force. He sold his hunting equipment, his dogs, his horses, everything associated with the profession that had defined his life, and moved to Montgomery, where he worked in a warehouse loading cotton onto steamboats. Anonymous labor that let him disappear into a city where no one knew his history or cared about his shame. He drank too much and slept too little, and died young in 1862, just as the Civil War was beginning to tear the South apart, just as the world he'd helped maintain through violence and terror was starting its long overdue collapse. His youngest brother Caleb inherited what remained of the Blackwood family property, but he couldn't hold on to it, couldn't make it profitable without the system of slave labor that had always sustained it, and within 5 years it was sold at auction to pay debts. The Devil's Pocket remained, as it had always remained, a place apart from human concerns, a reminder that some ground refuses to forget what happened on it, that certain debts can never be fully paid, that justice delayed is not the same as justice denied. In the years that followed, during and after the Civil War, during Reconstruction and its violent backlash, during the long, terrible century of Jim Crow that would follow emancipation, people continued to speak of the swamp in whispers, continued to say that the dead walked there, that something waited in that black water for those who came hunting the vulnerable, that the reversal that began in 1855 was not an isolated incident, but a promise, a warning, a vow that evil would not go forever unanswered even if justice took generations to arrive. Josiah, Eliza, Amos, and Levi eventually made it to Ohio, crossing into free territory in the winter of 1856 after months of moving from safe house to safe house, trusting their lives to strangers who risked everything to help them, navigating by the North Star and the directions whispered by conductors on the Underground Railroad who knew routes and hiding places that weren't marked on any map. They settled in a small community outside Cincinnati, where other freed and escaped slaves had built lives, working whatever jobs they could find. Josiah as a dock worker loading steamboats, Eliza as a domestic servant for a Quaker family who treated her with basic human decency. For the first time in her life, Amos and Levi as laborers on construction crews, building the city's expanding infrastructure. It wasn't easy, wasn't the paradise they'd imagined during their desperate flight through Alabama's backwoods, because freedom without resources or education or connections was still a hard life, still meant struggling to survive in a world that didn't much want them, even if it couldn't legally enslave them. Northern whites were often just as racist as their southern counterparts, just less likely to express it through whips and chains, more likely to manifest it through discrimination in housing and employment, through neighborhoods where black families weren't welcome, through wages that were always lower than what white workers received for the same jobs. But it was still freedom, still meant they could make choices about their own lives, could walk down a street without needing a pass, could speak their minds without fearing instant punishment, could dream about futures that belonged to them rather than to masters who saw them as property. They never spoke publicly about what happened in the Devil's Pocket, never told the full story of the risen dead and the hands reaching from Blackwater and the reversal that had saved their lives, because they understood instinctively that such tales would make them seem mad or superstitious, would give ammunition to those who claimed that black people were primitive and childlike and couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. But among themselves, in private moments when they gathered for Sunday meals or sat on porches on warm evenings, they remembered and gave thanks to ancestors they'd never known in life, but who'd proven more loyal in death than most living people ever managed. Eliza kept a small altar in her room, a Christian cross surrounded by items that would have seemed random to anyone who didn't know their significance, a piece of cypress bark from the Devil's Pocket, a vial of its black water, a drawing of symbols her grandmother had taught her represented protection and justice. She made offerings there on significant dates, the anniversary of their escape, the date of their crossing into Ohio, days when she felt the weight of memory pressing particularly hard, and whispered prayers that blended languages and traditions, asking the dead to watch over those still in bondage, to protect the brave ones who tried to run, to punish those who profited from the buying and selling of human flesh. Josiah became something of a leader in the Cincinnati black community, using the skills he'd developed as a field hand to organize labor actions and mutual aid societies, understanding that freedom meant nothing if it wasn't backed by collective power and resources. He spoke at abolitionist meetings sometimes, telling sanitized versions of his escape that left out the supernatural elements but conveyed the horror of slavery and the courage required to resist it. He met Frederick Douglass once at a convention in 1857, and the great orator shook his hand and said he'd heard stories about runaways from Alabama who'd defied impossible odds, who'd become legends whispered about in slave quarters throughout the South. And Josiah had just smiled and said that sometimes legends were true, that sometimes the oppressed found allies in unexpected places, that the master's control was more fragile than it appeared. Douglas had looked at him with eyes that suggested he understood there was more to the story than Josiah was willing to share publicly, and the two men had shared a moment of silent acknowledgement that some truths were too dangerous or too strange to speak aloud in rooms full of white allies who might not believe or might not approve. Amos and Levi eventually saved enough money to buy a small farm just outside Cincinnati, land that actually belonged to them, soil they could work for their own benefit rather than to enrich masters who saw them as tools. It wasn't much, 20 acres of rocky ground that required backbreaking labor to make productive, but it was theirs, and that fact alone made every sunrise worth witnessing, every crop worth nurturing with care. Their forced labor in Alabama had never warranted. They married local women, started families, raised children who were born free, and would never know the terror of the auction block or the sting of the overseer's whip. Those children grew up hearing simplified versions of their father's escape, stories that became family mythology, passed down through generations with details that shifted and changed but always maintained the core truth, that once, in Alabama's darkest heart, 4 desperate people had found the courage to run, had discovered protection in a cursed place, had survived against odds that should have killed them, and had built lives that testified to the indestructibility of human hope, even under the most crushing oppression. Back in Alabama, the Devil's Pocket's reputation only grew as the years passed, and the Civil War approached. More slaves disappeared into its depths, some making it out the other side to continue north, others vanishing completely and becoming part of the swamp's legends, adding their voices to the chorus of whispers that echoed through cypress trees and across black water. Plantation owners learned not to pursue runaways into that territory, learned that the cost in lost manhunters and traumatized survivors wasn't worth the value of any escaped slave, learned that some boundaries couldn't be crossed without consequences that defied rational explanation. A few attempted to drain the swamp or burn it out, hiring work crews to dig channels that would lower the water level or set fires that might destroy the protective cover the Devil's Pocket provided. But these efforts always failed in ways that seemed almost deliberately thwarted. Channels collapsed overnight. Fires extinguished themselves despite dry conditions. Workers fell ill with mysterious fevers or simply refused to continue after experiencing phenomena they couldn't explain and wouldn't discuss. The swamp remained, impervious to human intervention, a dark heart beating in the center of cotton country, a reminder that not everything could be owned or controlled or bent to the will of men who thought themselves masters of the universe. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, when the South's entire civilization built on the foundation of human bondage began its violent collapse, the Devil's Pocket took on new significance. Union soldiers approaching through Alabama heard the stories and gave the area wide berth, unwilling to risk their lives in a swamp that local black guides warned was haunted by something more dangerous than Confederate troops. Confederate deserters sometimes fled into its depths, choosing the uncertain protection of cursed water over the certain death that awaited them if they were caught abandoning their posts. Some emerged days or weeks later, changed in ways their former comrades couldn't quite articulate, speaking in hushed tones about visions they'd seen, voices they'd heard, offers of protection that came with prices they weren't sure they should have paid. A few never emerged at all, joining the collection of souls that the swamp had claimed over decades, adding their own reasons for remaining to the complex mixture of vengeance and sanctuary that defined the place. After the war, during Reconstruction, when freed slaves were trying to build lives in a South that violently resisted their new status as citizens with rights, the Devil's Pocket remained a touchstone for communities throughout Alabama. Elderly people who'd lived through slavery told their grandchildren about the place where the dead walked to protect the living, where manhunters had learned that their power had limits, where 4 brave souls had struck a blow for freedom that echoed far beyond their individual escape. Those stories helped sustain people through the betrayal of Reconstruction's end, through the rise of Jim Crow and the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, through decades of systemic oppression that took different forms than slavery, but pursued the same essential goal of keeping black people subjugated and denied full humanity. When lynch mobs rode through the night, when crosses burned on lawns, when economic oppression and political disenfranchisement made freedom feel like a hollow promise. People remembered the Devil's Pocket and took comfort in the knowledge that somewhere in Alabama's heart, there was a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where justice of a sort could still be found, where those who'd been murdered in the name of white supremacy still walked and watched and waited for opportunities to balance scales that the legal system refused to level. The swamp itself remained largely unchanged well into the 20th century, protected both by its reputation and by its unsuitability for development or agriculture. A few brave researchers tried to study it, documenting its unique ecosystem and the way certain areas seemed to defy normal ecological principles. But most gave up after experiencing equipment failures or psychological effects they couldn't explain in their academic papers. Local people continued to avoid it, except during times of desperate need, when someone fleeing violence or injustice might risk its borders hoping for the protection their ancestors had found there. Sometimes they emerged safely, speaking of guidance received from voices in the mist, or visions that showed them safe paths through treacherous terrain. Sometimes they didn't emerge at all, and their families would nod knowingly and say that the swamp had claimed another one, that the dead needed company, that perhaps the missing person had found peace among those who understood suffering in ways the living rarely could. Josiah died in 1889, an old man who'd outlived most of his generation, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his story forward into a new century. Eliza lived even longer, making it to 1902, her mind sharp until the end. Her final words a prayer in Yoruba that her granddaughter didn't understand but wrote down phonetically and preserved as a family treasure. Amos and Levi both passed in the 1890s, their farms still operating, their descendants still working soil that represented freedom in the most fundamental sense. And in Alabama, in Lowndes County, in the dark water of the Devil's Pocket, something continued to wait and watch, patient as stone, ready to offer protection to those who needed it and punishment to those who deserved it, a presence that transcended individual lives and spoke to collective memory, to the accumulated weight of centuries of injustice that demanded accounting even when human institutions failed to provide it. The hunters had been hunted in 1855, and the reversal they'd experienced echoed forward through time, a promise and a warning that some debts would eventually be paid, that power structures built on violence and oppression contained the seeds of their own destruction, that justice might be delayed but was never fully denied as long as the dead remembered and the living refused to forget. In 1855, Alabama, 4 enslaved people escaped into the Devil's Pocket swamp while being hunted by the notorious Backwoods brothers. But when the Manhunters followed them in, the dead rose from black water to turn predators into prey and prove that some ground refuses to forget what happened on it. Subscribe for more true horror from America's past, like if this story of supernatural justice moved you, and comment whether you believe the Devil's Pocket still protects those who need it most.